Back when I was a promising young student in pundit school, my teachers gave me a sage piece of advice, which I'm going to stick to today. They said, it's all once you get into the business of writing and talking about current events, everyone will want you to make predictions all the time. Now, in fact, they will know that you do not know and cannot possibly know what the future holds, but they will still want you to tell them. So when they ask, is it it's always good to give a date, and it's always good to give a number, but it's never good to give a date and a number. So I'm not going to do that tonight. It was fascinating to hear somebody from, in an Ulster accent, showing such detailed knowledge of American history and American politics and American polling. A little frightening, actually. I'm glad I wasn't here on the eve of a British election, because the amount of knowledge that I would have heard, I think, would be truly intimidating. There are a couple of things that maybe from a U.S. perspective I would throw in to sort of supplement the picture that we just heard. One would be, it's interesting, and this is actually sometimes something you find in the U.S. as well. Whenever people talk about a gender gap, they immediately go on to talk about Republican problems with women. But there's another gender gap there too, which is Democratic problem with men. That is, one poll I haven't seen, but I think would be fascinating, would be the percentage of non-Jewish heterosexual men, white men in the United States who support Obama. It is probably less than 30. And that is, and although that group is only about 40% of the population, that's a lot of people not to be voting for you. It is also true that those men have often sisters and wives who sometimes do listen to them, even in America. This happens. The other thing I think that suggests that the race may be even closer than you were saying is that historically undecided voters tend to break at this point against the incumbent, tend to go for the challenger. And the fact that the voting is sort of Romney 47, Obama 47 in the polling means that you've got about 6% there that haven't broken. Typically, they break about 2 to 1 for the challenger. And that, if you put that in, Romney would be a little bit, things look a little bit better for him than they do under a more conventional analysis. It's also true, by the way, in terms of thinking about the state polling, that the polls of polls and averages in state polling often are a day or two behind the national polling, simply because at this point in the race we're getting 8 national polls a day. We aren't getting quite as many from even a swing state like Ohio that everyone is studying. So that you're not looking, when you look at swing states and you look at national polls, you're not actually looking at, you're sort of looking at a time machine to some degree with the states. So if there is a trend toward Romney at this point, it would be showing up in the national polls before it shows up in the state. That said, I honestly have no idea who's going to win. This really is an unpredictable election, and I think the whole election process in the United States shows one of the reasons why democracy is such a durable form of government and why democracy is spreading. It's not necessarily that democracy produces better governance than other forms of government, but it is much more entertaining. You know, there is really nothing, an American presidential election is the greatest show on earth. It starts with the Iowa caucuses and it moves to the primaries, and you know, for the real aficionado, the fights every year as all the other states try to horn in on New Hampshire and Iowa that have those first primaries because they get all the attention, all the media spending. So you have these squabblings over which state is trying to jump the queue to have its primary first. You have those wonderful sort of debates. It's like the best reality show ever, where in the primary season each year a candidate gets voted off the island every month, and and you see the alliances form among the candidates. It's really just a wonderful thing. And then it comes down to this incredible horse race at the end. So I don't know who's going to win. But it's also true that the day after this election, whatever happens, the speculation for 2016 will begin. You know, is Hillary going to run in 2016? If Romney loses, where are the Republicans going? The stories will really, before the election returns, the ink on the returns is dry. The speculation will return. This, again, is one of the reasons why democracy is a durable form of government. Because as soon as the election return is in, if you don't like it, you don't like the winner, you can immediately begin to plot the overthrow of the current government. Like sports fans thinking, wait till next year. The sort of bitterness of defeat is immediately alleviated by thoughts of how now you're going to pull a coalition together, now you're going to win. So I think this is going to happen. One scenario that you didn't cover that may be of interest to people is what happens if there's a tie in the Electoral College? Because in fact there can be a tie in the Electoral College. What? No. There is a piece of American election trivia that you do not know. I'm glad I've come in all this way to clear up this vital point. All right. If there is a tie in the Electoral College, it goes to the House of Representatives, where each state gets one vote. And that means that the representatives of each state will caucus and they will vote, and then whichever party holds the majority of the representatives in that state controls that state's vote. What that means in practice is that Romney would win, because the Republicans tend to do very well in a lot of the smaller states. A lot of the Democratic congressmen are, say, from states like California and New York, where they really pile it up. In some ways, I think we can compare this to the election of 2004. That was a year in which most Americans were not particularly happy with the incumbent. George W. Bush had gotten us into wars. The economy was okay, but not so great. There was a lot of unease about where the country was, and a lot of people were very seriously looking at alternatives. And what happened in that election was that Senator Kerry failed to convince people that he was a viable alternative. And so people essentially in that election voted to stick with the devil they knew. Because the other guy just didn't quite, I don't know, maybe he spoke a little too much French. Maybe I don't know if some of you saw the commercial that the Bush people did of he was windsurfing, which is a sport in the U.S. that only very rich people do. And he was wearing sort of a funny-looking body stocking as he was windsurfing. And he just didn't somehow look to people like a president of the United States. And so Bush was able to win. The significance of the first debate between Romney and Obama was that when you put the two of them up together, Romney looked like he could be the president of the United States. He appeared to have the confidence, enough command of enough issues, and the sort of gravitas, so that a lot of people who had thought that maybe he wasn't really serious or was a lightweight or something said, okay, well, this guy might work. I'm going to take another look at him. And then in the subsequent debates, he didn't disastrously collapse. So he managed, and again, in a foreign policy debate in particular, if you as the challenger can simply be up there on the stand and talk for 90 minutes with the president and have him not completely wipe the floor with you, then you are passing that threshold test. For a British audience, it's probably important to understand that the debates loom much larger for us than they do in a British election, although, of course, I guess Nick Clegg made quite an impression in the British debate. But the reason for this is you have question time in Parliament. You see the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition in a duel of wits, in an unscripted combat, where you can look at them unfiltered, you can watch it happening in real time, and make up your own mind about what kind of person each of these men or perhaps one day women are in a presidential race. This is our only chance at the debate, to see them together unscripted. And so those debates actually have a tremendous impact when there are a lot of when people are not quite sure which way they're going to go. So this is in my view, this is a radically unpredictable election. I think if the vote were held today, I think Obama would probably win. But the other thing that's happening is the news cycles have sped up so much with the internet, with television, with YouTube, so that more happens now politically in a day or a week than used to. I think there is still time for one or even two more significant reversals of momentum between now and Tuesday, November the 6th. We've seen in American elections serious swings in the last few days. Reagan did not seem to have a very large lead over Carter until even a couple of days before the election in 1980. George W. Bush seemed to have a fairly significant lead over Gore, but actually revelations that George W. Bush had a drunk driving arrest in Maine years and years ago significantly reduced his vote, because there are a number of conservative Christian voters who wondered whether he was serious. So anything can happen. If that makes people around the world a little bit uncomfortable, it also makes people in the United States a little bit worried too. We do not know what our future is going to be like. Well, what about foreign policy? You know, Americans, of course, we're tremendously interested in what's the new president going to do about the economy, what's going to happen to unemployment rate. Other people are a little bit interested in the American economy, but they're much more interested in American foreign policy. Who are we going to bomb next time? You know, what wacky thing will we decide to do, or what very sensible thing will we decide not to do? Foreigners are much more interested in American foreign policy as a general rule than Americans are, and with good reason. Let me just make a couple of points about, actually 3 points about where I think American foreign policy is likely to go no matter who wins this election. And sort of larger trends I think that are at work. The two candidates might respond to them in slightly different ways, but on the whole, this is what's shaping the way the United States is looking at the next period in our foreign policy. And I should emphasize, by the way, although the U.S. consulate has helped sponsor my visit and all, I am not here representing the U.S. government in any way. These are my personal views. First point I would make, I think, is that after a period of worry in American leadership circles about whether the United States in the 21st century was going to be willing or able to play the kind of global role that we've played in the last couple of generations, the pendulum is swinging back in the United States towards a more confident vision of the future. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One of them, and it's a very important one, I don't know how much the discussion of this has sort of penetrated over here, is the change in our energy outlook. Some of you may know that natural gas production in the United States has been going up significantly. In fact, it's gone up so much that prices for natural gas have crashed. This makes me very happy. I'm on the board of directors of my apartment building in New York. And every month when we look at our heating bill, we dance happily around the table. It is so unbelievably low because we luckily have chosen natural gas to heat with. The U.S. has hundreds of years of supplies. The first applications are being made now for the United States to export liquefied natural gas. But one of the things about natural gas as a source, by the way, it is of all the fossil fuels the least carbon intensive, so that U.S. CO2 emissions have actually fallen something like 20% and are slated to fall even more, although the U.S., as you all know, has nothing to do with such things as carbon trading or cap and trade or any of these kinds of things. But nevertheless, CO2 emissions have dropped further in the U.S. than they have in the European Union. And a lot of this has to do with the switch to natural gas. But because natural gas is much cheaper when you don't have to liquefy it, with a very expensive process and so on, it means that it's likely that the price of energy in the United States is going to be significantly below world levels for some time to come. This means that a lot of manufacturing, and especially energy-intensive manufacturing, is going to be more sort of economically more efficient in the United States than outsourcing. Interestingly, if you look at where this is happening geographically in the U.S., it's sort of the Mississippi, Missouri, Ohio river systems. It's in the interior of the country, between the Appalachians and the Rocky Mountains. So that for the last 50 years, most of our economic development and so on has moved from the interior to the coast. There may be a kind of a rebalancing here. In Ohio, one of the reasons that the words climate change were not mentioned in the debate was that that fracking for natural gas has been moving ahead quite rapidly in Ohio. And there it's creating a lot of jobs. Probably fracking, if President Obama wins Ohio, it will be because fracking brought the unemployment rate in Ohio down. So he is not going to bite the hand that is feeding him here. The brown jobs, as we can call them, rather than green jobs, are not just going to be in natural gas. The unconventional oil reserves, shale oil, and so on in the U.S., by some estimates with current technology, the U.S. may have 2, 3, 4 times the reserves of Saudi Arabia. There are estimates that by 2020, the U.S. may replace Saudi Arabia as the largest producer of oil in the world. Obviously, with all of these technical estimates and so on, we'll find out. But we've already seen massive increases in U.S. oil production, with more coming. So the United States, and by the way, the only country that has larger reserves of these new kinds of oil than the United States is Canada. North America is not only going to be self-sufficient in energy, it's going to be a significant exporter of energy. This is a big change. It also suggests, in addition to sort of improving U.S. economic outlook, creating a lot of blue-collar, high-paid jobs in the extraction and manufacturing industry, it also changes the dynamics in international relations in some ways. Probably Russia is the biggest loser of this kind of change. China actually will benefit to some degree. There will be, in any case, less resource competition among the great powers over energy than many people believe. And again, from the standpoint of the United States foreign policy, that's a fairly good piece of good news. That would be one thing I would say. The outlook for the United States is brighter than a lot of people have been thinking, or at least the pendulum is swinging toward a more optimistic place. Another element in the foreign policy calculations of the United States these days seems to be that if the outlook is brighter for the United States, it's less bright for China than many people have been thinking. That there are some clouds on the Chinese horizon that are worth thinking about. Some of you may know that the Chinese government actually spends more money on internal security than it does on external defense, which suggests something very powerful about what the Chinese, best placed to form an estimate, think about their country's prospects for political stability. But there are a couple of big issues facing China that are likely to curtail China's ability to sort of translate some of its economic growth and manufacturing strength into the sort of challenge to the United States that some observers have seen China trying to mount. The first one is very serious, and it has to do with their domestic problems. Just if you think about it, China has now created the greatest nightmare a ruling communist party can ever face, which is to say it now has an industrial proletariat. This is a horrible development from the standpoint of a communist government, because an industrial proletariat can organize, wants to organize, wants better wages and working conditions. There is a lot of labor unrest in China. And the first generation of peasants who come from the fields to get to the city, just give them any job. And you have fireworks out there. This is for me, thank you all I'm really quite touched. Yeah, that was my second thought. They're aimed at us. Now, So you have this, the first generation just wants to get a job. But the second generation has grown up in the city. They see these stores filled with these wonderful products. They watch television and see how people live. They see the fancy cars go by and they want a taste. But here's the problem. In the West, as productivity rose, we were able to find ways to distribute the gains in wealth between various classes of society, so that we were able to respond to worker unrest by social benefits, raising wages, and so on. But China faces, we all think of China as this very powerful low-wage competitor. China has low-wage competitors of its own. Indonesia, Bangladesh, Vietnam. There's a whole raft of countries out there ready, willing, and eager to take those manufacturing jobs out of China. In addition, automation is becoming very cheap. When wages hit a certain level in manufacturing, factory owners move to automation. That China is not going to find it easy to raise wages and to raise social benefits as a way to pacify an alienated, angry working class. So China may be a country to find out what Marxism really is. But in any case, I have a lot of hope that China will find some ways around this, but it's very likely that Chinese politics are going to be so shaped by some very long-term problems dealing with these issues that it is going to be less willing and able to think globally and to think about mounting some kind of challenge to the United States. Beyond that, as many of you know, China's one-child policy has given it a major demographic crisis. As China is facing many of the same problems that we face in Europe and the Western world, of the younger generation is smaller than the older generation. And so the pensions promised to the older generation, the survival of the older generation, now depends on a dwindling base of young working people. It's been said that China is the first country to grow old before it became rich. And I think we're going to see again a lot of calls on Chinese resources to manage this demographic problem. So those are sort of internal problems. Externally, China faces another problem, which is that if it begins to assert itself in the region, as we've seen it doing lately over islands with Japan and the South China Sea and the Philippines and so on, what happens? What happens is all of its neighbors immediately rush into the arms of the United States and say, help us, help us, help us. Japan is talking seriously not only about building up its navy and working more closely with the United States, it is talking about moving as much of its manufacturing as it can from China to countries like India and other places, Vietnam, other places with whom it has good political relations. We've seen a series of riots outside Japanese factories. You have companies like Sony saying it is not safe for us. The China risk is too great. We need to diversify our manufacturing. So China has two choices in its foreign policy. It can either rattle the bars of its cage and growl threateningly at its neighbors, which drive them into the arms of the United States and form a kind of coalition against it, or it can accept the status quo peaceably, which will mean no quarrel with its neighbors, but it means the 7th Fleet of the United States will continue to sail through these waters. China can't decide which of the two it wants to do. There's an immense dispute within China about what to do. But either way they go, they are not on the point of mounting the sort of challenge that the Soviet Union did, or the Japanese in the 30s and the 40s, and so on and so forth. So American foreign policy is not looking quite so gloomy as it did. Now we'll turn to the Middle East finally for my sort of last remarks on where foreign policy might be going. And here there's plenty of room for gloom and doom, as always. If you're ever feeling, this may help you all, if you ever feel that you're becoming too cheerful and you're not taking a serious enough view of life, start thinking about the Middle East. You will find that very soon your mood comes back down to earth. The Middle East is a mess. Amazingly, the Arab Spring has not solved the deep political, cultural, social, and economic problems of the region. If we look at, say, Egypt as an example, the Egyptian economy is imploding. Egypt needs very large loans from the IMF. Egypt faces a variety of challenges. One of them is that Egypt desperately needs a healthy tourist industry. It's one of the major sources of revenue for the government. It's one of the major sources of employment for the people. Probably not many of you are planning a holiday to Egypt anytime soon. Right? And again, Egypt's biggest source of tourism has traditionally been Europe, where again, suddenly many people in Europe it's not only that they're worried about violence in Egypt, they're worried about how much money do I have and what's the economy doing. So that Egypt is having a hard time keeping its tourism going. Oil prices remain high. Food prices are high. Egypt has to subsidize food prices in the country. And when external prices rise, the amount of money the government has to spend to make food available to the average Egyptian goes up. Where's that money coming from? Again, in a climate of austerity, how much economic aid is Europe preparing to send to Egypt? Same with the United States, where we face our fiscal cliff after this election. And we're talking about debt and debts and cutting back on Medicare and Social Security. Foreign aid is certainly going to take some substantial hits. And at the very least, we can't look for very large increases. So, given that kind of situation, it makes it very hard for the sort of moderate democratic forces to consolidate power. And you're likely to see, I think, a very tricky political situation. Syria, 30,000 people dead, religious, ethnic hatreds approaching new heights, radicals getting arms, the rebels increasingly divided against each other. We are likely to see many more thousands dead, perhaps many more tens of thousands dead. It may be a long time before there's peace in Syria again. You can think about Lebanon, which endured decades of intermittent civil war and ethnic hatred. That's a very real possibility for Syria. So the Middle East is not looking happy these days. President Obama's approach to the Middle East has largely been to try to get America to reduce America's footprint in the Middle East, to try to manage the problems there less by sending in American troops or less by having an American ambassador sort of try to control the policy of a government, than to sort of pull back and think about how can we have a balance of power in the region. Also, how can we cooperate with some of the new forces? The Erdogan government in Turkey. President Obama has invested a lot of time and effort in building his relationship with Prime Minister Erdogan. He is hoping that President Morsi in Egypt can be also a sort of a moderate Islamist, in sort of the same way that during the Cold War, the Social Democrats were actually America's best help and friend against the communists. Sort of, give a sort of a mild vaccination, a mild dose of Islamism to countries that then will inoculate them against the most virulent form. And so that, I think, has been President Obama's approach to Egypt and to Turkey. And to some degree, he's had some success. And certainly Turkey and the United States have been working together on a number of important issues, including both Syria and Iran. On Iran, I think no matter who gets elected, the chances of a war between the U.S. and Iran, or at least of some kind of military conflict, are higher than I would like to see. President Obama's strategy has been to give diplomacy and sanctions time to work. But in order to buy that time for this strategy to work, and by the way, I agree with the strategy wholeheartedly, in order to get time for that strategy to work, he has had to make ever more categorical statements that he will not accept an Iranian bomb. So that to some degree, so it would be very, very hard for him now to go back on those. And to gain more time, he will have to make even more definite statements. He's already said containment is not an option. Iran will not be allowed to get the bomb. This is often, by the way, played in the press as an Israel-America story. What no one should ever forget is that it is also an Arab-America story. That is, the Saudis, the Kuwaitis, the Bahrainis, a number of other Arab governments are at least as worried about Iran as the Israelis. And behind the scenes, and sometimes openly, they are saying to the United States, why are you waiting so long? When are you going to attack them? We need you to do this now. I've been hearing that for years, and I'm sure that more senior people than me are hearing it more often. So America's allies in the region are pushing us hard in this direction, and it becomes very difficult to resist it. The president wants to give it more time. I think he's right to want to do that. I don't think we're at that final point. But this shadow does hang over the Middle East and American policy in the Middle East. I hope that with help from the European Union and other countries, we can continue to tighten the sanctions. It would be terrible if more mysterious computer viruses made even more difficulty for Iranian cyclotrons. That would make us all very sad, but sometimes these things happen. So we'll see. But it's a complicated picture. I actually think in practice, Governor Romney's policies in the Middle East are not going to be that different from President Obama's policies should the voters in Ohio do funny things in a month or in a couple of weeks. Anyway, that's a quick look at things from my perspective. I'd be very happy to take questions or comments or anything else you've got on that.
Thanks for a fascinating speech, and I'm sure you're capable of taking questions yourself, but I've been sent up to help with it.
That's great. No one can hate me if you're unfair in picking the questions.
I mean, a couple of things that struck me listening to it is, I mean, there's a number of areas where the US seems to have an open commitment. There's an open commitment to Israel, to Taiwan, and also in Europe, where Europe basically doesn't pay for its own defense. Can that continue even on the back of more oil and gas in America? And also I was interested to hear you talking about optimism based on fracking, because here, where we're living, we've got a lot of shale gas reserves, and it's looked on as a curse. None of the politicians want to deal with it, but you see it differently there.
Well, that's, I mean, I'm not sure why they see it as a curse here, but it is possibly because you know, in the U.S., again, it's a divisive issue, and there are serious environmental issues connected to fracking. But I think even in democratic circles, it's partly seen that what we need to do is figure out how to make it work rather than shun it like the devil. Because, again, from the American standpoint, where we see ourselves, you know, the fear of becoming energy dependent on people we don't much like, and who certainly don't much like us, is a real worry. But also the need to have high-income, blue-collar jobs. You know, people in the oil and gas industry in the United States without college diplomas can earn $60,000 to $110,000, $120,000 a year. That's a good living. It's a very good living. And it's partly, I think, because a lot of energy policy in the U.S. is actually made at the state level rather than the federal level, so that the governor of Ohio can push fracking, and it can help him with his state and his popularity, rather than having national politicians, many of whom won't represent areas that would economically benefit from it. And then even in the U.S., environmentalists who are otherwise rather cautious about fracking do see it as the kind of silver bullet that will kill coal, because it reduces abundant national gas. Basically means under U.S. circumstances we won't be getting more coal power plants, and it forces coal prices down because it has to compete with low natural gas. So in terms of the carbon situation, natural gas is still seen as a net plus.
Any other questions?
I didn't do your others, but we can get.
Well, that's just the whole world I asked.
Yeah, just the whole world. I'm sorry. I get so, you know, I'm so giddy with our natural gas.
I see this gentleman over here.
Yeah.
You talked about economic policy, you talked about foreign policy, what about economic foreign policy and foreign economic policy? Romney, am I right, is to stop the Chinese either. What exactly does that mean? And what's a balance taking?
Okay. Well, I think it means essentially nothing. I think traditionally in American politics, the challenging candidate denounces the incumbent for being too soft on China. This was Bill Clinton against George H.W. Bush. It was George W. Bush against Gore. It was Obama against McCain. The Chinese, at least the ones I talked to, simply ignore this. If anything, the Chinese, perhaps incorrectly, but they do tend to think that Republicans are easier for the Chinese to work with. They're still thinking Nixon and Kissinger, and that they were able to get things done with them. So the Chinese are not alarmed yet. My guess is they probably won't be. As you know, the Chinese currency has been going up in any case. And frankly, if we're going to talk about currency manipulation, it seems to me that endless quantitative easing is, let us say, indistinguishable from currency manipulation on a pretty serious scale. I think overall, in terms of economic policy, the U.S. is going to hope the European Union doesn't collapse economically, but there's not. I don't think many people in the U.S. think there's much we can do about that one way or the other. There will be an effort, I think, to continue to try to tighten the enforcement of WTO rules on China and other countries. Intellectual property is a serious issue, and we're going to continue working on that. My guess would be that for a lot of domestic reasons, Democrats tend to be a little slower these days to work on free trade issues. I think Governor Romney and the Republicans would probably try to do a little bit more of that. The interesting exception is a free trade agreement with the European Union, a much deeper kind of agreement. That would actually get more support in the U.S. from labor unions and other Democratic constituencies. And so I would personally hope that under either Republican or a Democratic administration, there'd be a little bit more energy in that area.
Anyone else?
Liam, if nobody else is. You touched on two issues that I think slightly call into question this very optimistic view of American and Western future that you put forward. I don't disagree with in all respects. I'm glad somebody has finally noticed that North America is stuffed with energy, which is never talked about. But there are blue clouds on the horizon, and I wonder what your view are on those. What is debt and its form of reason? Climbed up on societies which on either side of the Atlantic have enormous government debt, enormous individual debt, and enormous corporate debt. That's one. The other is demographics. We are getting older. Caring for older people is getting more and more expensive. We don't dislike what out pay for it.
Yeah. I think there is a real crisis facing Western society and ultimately world society. Frankly, I don't think either presidential candidate really has an answer for what to do. I'm not sure anybody does. When I try to put it all together and think about it as one big thing, it seems to me that what we're doing in the advanced country, first of all, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, we all believed that history was over, in the sense that we thought the kind of mass prosperity, mass manufacturing, mass middle-class societies that Western Europe, North America, and Japan built after World War II were that was it. And that what would happen in the future was things would get a little bit better. We'd all get a little bit richer every year. The cars would get a little nicer, the TVs would get a little nicer, but the institutions that we built, the social entitlements that we built, the mechanisms for distributing income and so on that we built would simply sail on indefinitely. Which, if you think about how tumultuous the history of the last 400 years has been, and how many deep and sweeping changes have taken place, is absurd, is ridiculous. it would be the most unlikely thing possible. But we all believed it, and we don't really want to think about anything else because we like it. However, the reality is that manufacturing is dead in terms of providing a mass, middle-class, stable existence. It's comparable in my mind to what happened in farming in the 19th century. The old American dream, in 1880, the American dream had nothing to do with a house in the suburbs and a job in a factory. It was entirely about an owner-occupied farm and having your own land. More than 50% of Americans made their living in agriculture. Today, less than 6% do. Manufacturing is going the way of the farm. Because, and it's a good story, in the same way that farms became more productive. Manufacturing is becoming more productive. The United States today, actually, in terms of value added, our manufacturing has been booming for 30 years. We are producing something like 150, 200% the value added in manufacturing that we did in the 1970s, but we're doing it with a much smaller workforce. Again, from a human point of view, that's good. People now talk about manufacturing jobs like they're the most wonderful thing in the world. It's dark, dirty, dangerous, repetitive, soul-destroying work. When manufacturing came in, the labor movement and the left attacked it as, the apotheosis of alienation of labor, the most horrible thing you could do, destructive of human potential, blah, blah, blah. Now, when they're gone, the left is going, oh, it's the most wonderful thing ever. It isn't. Right? However, we are moving from a late-stage industrial society and economy to an early-stage information society and economy. And the thing is, we don't know how, we have to make it up. We don't know what it is. What are the institutions that make it work? What kind of educational system? Our modern educational system was made for a world of manufacturing and sort of repetitive clerical labor. That's what most people did. And so what school did was it taught you very slowly to sit at a desk, wait for the bell, follow orders, behave, be patient for the inevitable promotion that would come at the end of the year, all of that sort of thing. Right? But the modern system of mass education is the child of the factory. What will education look like in a world where actually children may have to be raised to be much more entrepreneurial, to change careers? Often it may be that many part-time jobs rather than one full-time job will become the characteristic way that people make their living. We just don't know. The next generation is going to have to build a new way of living, just as in the 20th century people had to build a new way of living. A big problem now is that we all feel the distress of the collapse of the old system. There's a lot of nostalgia for the old system. But politicians and policy wonks don't really know what we should be doing at this point. In American history, I compare this era to the Gilded Age, which from 1865 to about 1900, American politics were at kind of a nadir. Corruption. This is also known as the age of the robber barons, of rising inequality, the Industrial Revolution. The institutions, the beliefs, the practices that Americans had before the Civil War in a pre-industrial society no longer work. It's even experts in American politics have a hard time naming a senator who held office between 1865 and 1900. Almost all of those presidents are completely forgotten. Right? It was an era of comprehensive political corruption and failure. But by 1900, America had become the largest industrial power in the world and actually had developed the resources and the ideas and the capabilities that would allow us in the progressive era to lay the foundations for the kind of mass prosperity modern society that after World War II would spread to much of the world. I think we are in an era of political failure, of politics not being able to keep up with history. And it means that people who focus on politics and look to politics for answers tend to be quite depressed. But then you look around at America and you see people like Steve Jobs, you see new companies coming up, you see ways of, you see all of these changes in the sort of material resources available to society, the ways people can learn and act, all of these changes taking place. I think the foundations are being laid for something better. But it's not going to come overnight, and it's not going to come without a lot of pain and anxiety. So I don't think President Obama has the answers to this. I don't think Governor Romney has the answers to this. As far as I can tell, David Cameron doesn't have the answers to this either. So we're going to blunder forward. Other societies have the ability to think, okay, we want to catch up to the West. We want to become more like Europe, more like North America, and so on. They've got a goal. And it's easier to plan when you have a known goal. We do not have a known goal. That makes it extremely difficult to plan. In a sense, it makes us more eager to plan because there's so much uncertainty, but it tends to mean that government plans don't work as well. I wish I had an answer for you, but at least, it's an interesting question.
I see another over here. Yep.
Thanks very much. Really thought-provoking presentation so far. Thanks for that. Lots of questions, but I'll stick to one. President Obama has seen a big expansion, or overseen a big expansion of the killing by remote-controlled drones, particularly in the tribal regions in Pakistan. And obviously that's seen as a success story within the administration to more efficient or safer for American personnel way of targeting and killing people. I'm sure it would be no different under Romney if it was the that. Is there any concern within political circles in Washington or whatever field that is potentially setting some dangerous precedents, even if it's just a case of considering when other countries start to harness the same technology and the same innovative legal arguments to justify this? So whenever Russia or China or North Korea or Hezbollah start using that technology and those American legal arguments to kill their enemies in other countries, is that seen as some concern in the usual law and the technology?
Well, I think, I think the fact, sort of one of the problems of modernity is that weapons technology develops and creates new problems, and you get a weapon and then other people get the same weapon, and so you have to get another weapon that's a step ahead. And so in that sense, this drone issue is simply the latest. I mean, there was a time when the Americans were the only people with machine guns. Now a lot of people have them. We used them in our Civil War. So this is that would be seen as probably the way most Americans would see this is just one more example of yet another weapon, the atom bomb being perhaps the greatest example of you get it and use it, and then now you have to live in a world where other people have it, and you don't necessarily like all the consequences of that. That's... Well, but those legal arguments apply to other issues as well. The high seas, sanctions, all kinds of things. And I think that in general also, in Afghanistan, U.S. forces are acting under a, with UN mandate, and also in a, under NATO Article 5 and with a U.S. congressional statement. So there's actually a fairly robust legal situation there. And in terms of Pakistan, while the Pakistani government isn't going to say so on record, it is obvious to every child that the Pakistani government not only permits this, but provides a lot of the intelligence that enables it to happen. You know, in that sense, in comparable situations, you know, it might not be such a problem if other people were doing it. But obviously, you know, things are complicated. Law and violence are constantly fighting each other, and the results are sometimes rather tricky and complex. But I think probably Americans at the end of the day feel that we lead the world in the production of lawyers, and we'll continue to do so for some time to come.
Yeah.
Yeah, just Patrick was saying fascinating to hear you say that. Thank Peter McKittrick, who's the main organizer as well. It's been fantastic. So there's a lot of questions I'd like to ask. One is on Mexico and all of the violence that's been taking place there. There's been a lot of coverage here. How big an issue is that in terms of foreign policy? And another issue, I suppose, as well, from an outsider's point of view, watching the gridlock in American politics over the last 4 years. Obama's been trying to do the things, and then the Republicans aren't playing ball. How bad do things have to get in terms of being able to tackle America's problems before someone starts to say we need to take a look at our political system?
On the Mexico question, let me just say that you are particularly fortunate here in Belfast, and that the new, you guys are an example to the world of how a lot of violence can be dealt with, and probably are better positioned than I am to understand some of the mechanics that are there. Well, yeah, right. There are different reasons. But sort of non-state actors working in a very organized way, you may be able to interpret some of that better than I can do. But, I think that one of the things to remember about Mexico is that even as this violence progresses, Mexico is also in many ways continuing to develop. There are two stories in Mexico. Wages are rising. A lot of manufacturing is actually moving from China to Mexico as wages rise in China. And in demographic terms, very interestingly, Mexico has had the kind of demographic transition so that the fertility rate has dropped quite dramatically. Very soon, the number of young people entering the workforce at 18 every year will begin to shrink. So that this sort of idea that many of us have of Mexico as this sort of uncontrollable demographic volcano and chaos and youth bulge and so on is less and less accurate. One thing that's happened in some parts of the country is that as one drug gang beats the others, the number of killings drops. I think Juarez, the city of Juarez now has become fairly pacified, again, because one drug gang controls it. And there may be higher levels now of kneecappings and so on here than there are in Juarez. People talk about it in the United States, but don't see a lot that we can do. It's just sort of there. And I'm sorry, your other question? The gridlock. Well, for the first 2 years of President Obama's term, we didn't have gridlock. He had a solid majority in both houses. And, whether you like it or not, Obamacare was a very, very significant legislative achievement. It's something that presidents have been trying to do since Harry Truman tried it. Lyndon Johnson couldn't get it. Richard Nixon couldn't get it. So I'm not, so fine, half of his term is gridlock, but half of his term was was by historic standards a very significant legislative era. So I'm not so sure that I would say that we've entered some sort of new condition of permanent gridlock. I don't think that's a good description at all. I think what we do have is we don't know how to fix the future not of our health care generally, because I think Obamacare is far from the last piece of legislation that will be needed on this, but in particular our elder care, where we essentially already have the national health for people over 65. It's called Medicare, and you know it's an entitlement. You get it. And because of these demographic issues, we're getting more and more old people, and we're also getting more and more treatments that they can take. And if you look at the federal budget, Social Security is not a big issue, defense is not really a big issue, Medicare is a colossal issue. And that involves less a budgetary question, however, ultimately, than it's a policy question. How do we get the kind of healthcare system that we can afford? Or how do we content ourselves to live with the kind of, the limits on what we can afford in healthcare? And in that sense, I think that tends to fall a little bit under this category of questions that we ask in American politics but don't know how to answer because the answers don't exist. If we think about what is the healthcare system of the future, of 30 or 40 years from now look like, my guess is that something along the lines of there'll be a little box in your house and you'll stick your finger in that box. Maybe it will prick you, or maybe it will be so advanced it doesn't even need to do that. And it will be hooked to computers that every detail of your DNA and your genealogical makeup, your entire medical history, everything that you've taken, that you are taking, your parents, your grandparents, as far back as records go, it will also be hooked into every medical study ever done anywhere, every hospital record, and so on. And it will look at everyone who's ever had your condition, look at how, measure that by what your genotype is in your medical history. Here are the 3 most likely treatment options, and out will pop something, right? A very different kind of healthcare system than we have now. Probably a lot less of the knowledge in that healthcare system will be held by doctors. We're already seeing that specialists have to specialize in smaller and smaller fields simply to keep up with the explosion in medical knowledge. That explosion is only going to accelerate. So the human beings in the healthcare system will be more like flight attendants on a plane, who are helping you feel comfortable about the process. And in that sense, thinking about the American budget and deficit requires, how do we create a kind of a legal framework and policy framework that can help the healthcare system make this radical transformation? Again, the healthcare system of the 19th century looked very little like the healthcare system of the 20th century. My guess is the healthcare system of the 21st century, once it finally arrives, will not look a lot like the system of the 20th. And will probably be both better and in some important ways more affordable. But getting there we have to start asking some very different questions. So I would argue that gridlock is only the tip of the iceberg of a much deeper question that we face. And our policy imaginations have to grow. I think that's the key.
I think we're just about time for one more, if there's anybody. Yes.
Yeah, I just want to ask if you had any insights into future American economic policy and how it might affect Ireland, given that American companies are big employers on the island of Ireland. And I'm not as big a student of US politics as, say, Jerry was, but I do recall a couple of years ago, there's a lot of pressure on policymakers in terms of seeing to repatriate jobs back to the US, cut down on tax havens and that. Is that still an issue?
I don't think I've ever heard a national politician in America denounce job outsourcing to Ireland. I don't think I've ever heard Ireland described as an evil tax haven. So Ireland is, both sides, by the way, of Ireland are places that Americans kind of like. And American politicians would much rather sort of be heard saying, would much rather march in a St. Patrick's Day parade than denounce Irish chicanery and evil doing. So my own sense is that the United States only wants more trade with Ireland, more investment. From our point of view, Ireland is one of those places that has nothing wrong with it. And, live free and prosper. That's basically the American attitude toward Ireland, so far as I understand it. I hope it's reciprocated.
I think I'll wind it up at that point, but there will be a chance to mingle and have a chat and so on. So let's do that. And thanks very much. It was a fascinating presentation, even though you didn't tell me about Israel, Taiwan, and Western Europe. But
we'll fix it one of these days.
That's for the next time. But thanks very much indeed.